In 2026, the most important decisions about the Iran conflict were not made in Washington, Tel Aviv, or Tehran. They were made in offices with no windows, by people whose names never appear in news coverage, moving numbers that most governments cannot comprehend. Within 72 hours of the opening strikes, 3 of the world's 10 largest sovereign wealth funds had already repositioned. The conflict had barely started. The verdict was already in. Iran enriched uranium to 60% purity while actively sitting at the negotiating table. That is not an accident of timing. That is a message. We negotiate from a position you cannot ignore. By early 2025, Iran had accumulated enough 60% enriched uranium that the technical breakout timeline had compressed to an estimated few weeks, down from over a year when the JCPOA was signed in 2015. That is not a diplomatic problem. That is a countdown. The JCPOA bought time, but time without structural resolution doesn't reduce pressure. It concentrates it, like a compressed spring. Hold it down long enough, the release becomes violent. By 2025, the geometry was almost identical to the months before the 1967 Six-Day War. Multiple actors, each reading the others as bluffing, each incrementally escalating, until escalation stopped being incremental. Israel had a documented red line. The United States had a stated position and a domestic political calendar that constrained it. Gulf states had signed normalization agreements that put them in an uncomfortable middle. Iran's internal leadership was split between factions where one needed results and the other saw value in ambiguity. Every compressed spring eventually releases. In 2026, it did, and the signal it sent to every government managing its own version of that tension was unambiguous. The spring releases. Iran's air defense was not unsophisticated. S-300 batteries. Domestically produced Bavar 373 systems. Layered radar coverage. Serious enough that Western analysts had modeled it as capable of imposing meaningful cost on any attacker. It degraded faster than the models predicted. Pre-conflict assessments had estimated that a sustained air campaign against Iran's integrated air defense network would require days of attrition. The operational reality in 2026 compressed that window dramatically. Primary radar and command nodes were disrupted within the first operational cycle, measured in hours, not days. The mechanism wasn't a single breakthrough weapon, it was sequencing. Electronic suppression first, blinding the radar picture, then decoy saturation, overwhelming the discrimination algorithms, then precision strike into the gaps. The sequence exploited something no amount of expensive hardware solves, the decision speed gap between human operators and automated threat environments. Defense ministries from Warsaw to Seoul watched those 96 hours and ran the same internal calculation. Every major regional conflict produces a procurement paradigm shift. After the 1982 Falklands, surface ships are more vulnerable to anti-ship missiles than doctrine assumed. After Nagorno-Karabakh 2020, Azerbaijan's drone-enabled victory over a conventionally superior force in 44 days restructured procurement priorities across 60 countries within 18 months. After 2026, static defense is structural liability. Mobile systems, distributed networks, AI-assisted threat discrimination. The countries that absorb that lesson fastest hold the decisive edge in the next confrontation, wherever it occurs. 21 miles wide. That is the Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest point. 21 miles separating approximately 20% of the world's daily traded oil from the open ocean. On a peak day, that choke point handles roughly 17 to 18 million barrels, more than the entire daily output of the United States. For decades, the vulnerability was discussed in policy papers. Energy ministers knew it. And then, collectively, they decided to treat it as acceptable background risk, because eliminating that dependence cost more than the probability-adjusted cost of the risk materializing. 2026 reset that calculation. not because the strait was closed, because it entered active operational consideration for the first time since the 1980s tanker war. And when a theoretical vulnerability becomes a demonstrated one, the entire risk model resets. India accelerated Central Asian pipeline talks that had moved at diplomatic pace for years, suddenly at emergency pace. Japan and South Korea restructured LNG contracts with explicit conflict contingency clauses, language that had never appeared in those agreements before. China's strategic petroleum reserve, already among the largest in the world, had been quietly expanding since 2022. By 2026, it represented an estimated 90 days of import coverage, a buffer that would have been unthinkable as a planning target a decade earlier. The 1973 oil embargo lasted 5 months and permanently rewired Western energy strategy for 3 decades. The 2026 conflict appears to be its 21st century structural equivalent. The investments being made right now will shape energy geopolitics until 2050. But here is what the energy data does not show. While procurement desks were repricing Hormuz risk in barrels per day, a completely separate calculation was happening in foreign ministries, because every country that just watched the strait enter active operational consideration asked the same question within hours. If this escalates further, who exactly stands next to us? And the answer, when governments started pulling the thread, was more complicated than any alliance charter suggested. Because alliances on paper and alliances under pressure are two different things. The 2026 conflict did not just stress test military hardware, it stress tested political commitments, and the results of that stress test are now permanently on the record, visible to every actor on Earth who needs to know where the fractures are. What they found will make you rethink everything you assumed about Western strategic unity. When an alliance fractures under pressure, the fracture map becomes a permanent strategic asset for every adversary of that alliance. The NATO divergence in 2026 was subtle. Several European governments were carefully ambiguous in their public positioning. Understandable politics. Strategically, it's a documented vulnerability now. Every actor on Earth knows which NATO members move fast and which ones hesitate. Which ones can be pressured through economic levers? Which ones have domestic dynamics that make sustained commitment difficult? That knowledge doesn't expire, it gets filed, and it gets used. On the other side, the Abraham Accords architecture held. Gulf states that normalized with Israel in 2020 did not publicly fracture those relationships under 2026's pressure. The positioning was ambiguous, but the architecture held. That validates the core theory. Shared threat perception creates durable alignment even under domestic political pressure. It also validated something the Accords architects had always argued privately, that economic integration, the $3 billion in trade that had developed between Israel and Abraham Accord signatories by 2025, creates structural incentives that survive political pressure better than diplomatic agreements alone. The Russia-China posture was the most revealing. Neither wanted prolonged conflict, neither was willing to visibly constrain Iran. The result, enabling without committing, restraining without visibly restraining, exposes the partnership's fundamental structure. It is built on a shared rival, not shared values. And that distinction matters enormously when a situation requires positive, constructive alignment rather than shared opposition. Every time that partnership is tested, the structural fragility becomes slightly more visible. The aspect of 2026 that will matter most in 20 years received the least coverage in 20 hours. During the first 48 hours of the 2026 conflict, researchers tracking social media platforms identified over 40 distinct coordinated narratives circulating simultaneously, some state-sponsored, some algorithmically amplified organic content, some AI-generated. The majority of mainstream audiences encountered at least 3 mutually contradictory versions of events before any official government statement had been issued. During the Cold War, Information flowed through a limited number of channels. During Vietnam, television broke that control for the first time. Military strategy became constrained by living room perception in real time. That was a structural shift. 2026 is a qualitative jump beyond Vietnam, fully distributed, algorithmically amplified, AI assisted. Every state and non-state actor can generate and distribute competing versions of reality at essentially zero marginal cost. The strategic implication: when a society cannot converge on a shared factual baseline about a conflict, the political will to sustain any response becomes structurally unstable. Adversaries have understood this for years. Narrative fragmentation as a force multiplier, creating confusion, amplifying domestic division, making sustained response politically costly, is now a documented, practiced strategic tool. Future confrontations will be won or lost, not primarily on the battlefield, in the feed. And the actors most willing to operate in that environment without constraint have a structural advantage over those bound by standards of accuracy and attribution. That asymmetry is not self-correcting, and no government on earth has yet produced a credible answer to it. European defense spending accelerated again after 2026. Germany, which had resisted expansion for decades on post-war political culture, found that resistance substantially reduced. That is a structural shift in European political economy that compounds over decades. Gulf sovereign wealth funds reallocated toward defense technology and domestic manufacturing at measurably accelerated rates. Saudi Vision 2030's defense industrialization component moved from priority to emergency priority. In Asia, China's documented strategic anxiety about energy supply routes through choke points it doesn't control. The Malacca dilemma intensified. Investment in domestic production, strategic reserves, and alternative supply routes accelerate in ways already visible in procurement data. The cumulative effect is not a sudden wealth transfer. It is structural reallocation away from globalized stability assumptions toward strategic self-sufficiency, and it is self-reinforcing. Countries that invest in resilience are better prepared for the next disruption. In a multipolar world, the next disruption is never far. This is how power shifts work. Not in dramatic collapse, in steady accelerating divergence of preparation. And by the time that divergence becomes visible to everyone, the countries that move first are already a decade ahead. In the 6 months following the 2026 conflict, global defense procurement orders increased at a rate not seen since 2001. Not because new confrontations started, because governments on 5 continents concluded that the next one, wherever it occurs, will move faster, hit harder, and leave less time to adapt than any model they had been using assumed. That conclusion is now priced into military budgets worldwide. The question is whether it's priced into your understanding of where this decade is heading. Subscribe. The next signal that changes everything already looks like background noise.